American Giant makes great clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, and more right here in the U.S. Visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order with code STAPLE20. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com, code STAPLE20.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
In 2024, Canadians made a combined 20 million visits to the United States, generating $20.5 billion in spending for the U.S. economy. That's pretty typical for two long-standing allies, friends, and neighbors. However, as you may have guessed, 2025 has been a very different story. With the trade war in full swing, including tariffs and even annexation threats, there is a palpable movement within the country to support Canadian while trying to avoid American products and travel. It's early, but the numbers are starting to back up that sentiment as Canadian travel to the U.S. is down 40% year over year. So what does that mean for the relationship now and in the future? And is this all a blip in time or the start of a longer-term movement? I'm Gurdeep Ahluwalia, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Amra Durakovic, Head of Public Relations and Communications for Flight Centre Travel Group Canada. Amra, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Gurdeep.
Okay, so let's get into it. Canadians and Americans, historically, the closest of allies, both economically and politically, but also in terms of, just being friendly neighbors whose residents do tons of cross-border shopping every year. Many of us, grew up with fond memories of piling into the family minivan on a weekend and driving across the border to go get all kinds of fun products you couldn't get here in Canada. Can you paint a picture of what kind of Canada-U.S. travel trends we were seeing up until a few months ago?
Absolutely. So in February 2025, as you mentioned, Flight Centre Travel Group, we observed a 40% decrease in leisure bookings to the U.S. compared to the same month last year. And over a 3-month period from November 2024 to January 2025, our leisure brand, Flight Centre Canada, saw a 20% cancellation rate on pre-existing U.S. trips. So many of those trips were, in fact, rebooked to sunny destinations like Mexico and the Caribbean. Now, I just want to add a little caveat there. In November, the U.S. had an election, so a new U.S. administration, and this is typical. We do notice every 4 years when there is a new U.S. administration, Canadians were rather conservative. So we'll hold back on our travels to the U.S. But in addition to a new U.S. administration in November, we also had the dollar hit a 4-year low. And then leading up November, December, January, unfortunately, Los Angeles had those devastating wildfires. All of these really impacted Canadians' travel choices to the U.S. So that's where you saw this 20% cancellation rate. And now, as we're moving into April, we are clearly seeing a shift in travel preferences. So while Canadians still want to travel and see the world, what we're noticing is they're being more intentional about where they go. So year to date, we do continue to see a softened demand to traditional U.S. destinations like California, Florida, Hawaii, Nevada, and New York. This is what I'm hearing not just from our travel experts, but as well as what we're seeing in our booking data. This is for leisure only. Interestingly, though, what we are seeing is Tennessee seems to be gaining traction. And this really, again, it aligns with what I'm hearing on the ground. We are booking trips heading to Nashville for milestone celebrations. So travel is deeply personal. While some Canadians are choosing not to travel to the U.S., others are still traveling to the U.S.
Okay, that's really interesting, Amra. If we can maybe further contextualize these numbers. So leisure travel from Canada to the U.S. is down 40% for February year over year. However, you're saying that when there is a new U.S. administration, which we just saw happen in January, it's typical for numbers to pull back a little bit. Is the 40% roughly in line with what we see with the new U.S. administration, or is this an unusually high drop year over year?
This is an unusually drop. This is definitely not typical. So we'll have to really wait and see. There's so much uncertainty right now with travel around the US that Canadians are just holding back. However, they're not stopping travel altogether. The good news is that the industry, if you look more broadly to what Air Canada, WestJet, and even Porter, what they're doing is they're sort of introducing new air routes. And specifically what we're seeing right now is an increase in demand for travel to Europe. So straight across Canada, straight across the travel industry, you're seeing more flights, more connectivity between Canada and Europe. We, in our own booking data at Flight Centre, we're noticing destinations like Amsterdam, Portugal, and the UK are really leading away, partially due to their own aggressive marketing from their tourism boards, but also, as I mentioned, more flight options. When you have more flight options, that means you have more seating capacity. With more seating capacity, you get competitive prices, which means Canadians are actually paying less for some international airfare. In fact, I've just looked at some of our data and we have seen, on average, Canadians can pay 17% less this year for some international flights as compared to the same period. That would be March, April, May, as compared to 2024.
It's fair to say if this were a dating app, Canada's U.S. relationship status would read it's complicated right now. There seems to be, a real change in sentiment with some Canadians in the way that they're choosing to engage with America and Americans at large, for that matter. You sort of alluded to it already with some of the adapting behaviors, but what's the current situation like on the travel front regarding how Canadians are behaving and responding to what they're seeing on a world stage? Is it simply, as you said, finding alternate destinations?
Well, yes, there are definitely fewer Canadians are choosing the U.S. at the moment. But as I said, they're exploring other destinations that better reflect their travel goals and their budgets. You have to remember that we have a weak Canadian dollar as well. So Canadians are proactively choosing destinations that are driven by exchange rates, airfare prices, as well as the desire for deeper connections that align with their values. And those values can be different. Some people might be looking for an adventure experience or a wellness retreat. I'm actually heading to Nicaragua this weekend for a wellness retreat. I'll be flying direct from Toronto to Costa Rica because Nicaragua does not have any direct flights, unfortunately. So I'll fly directly into Liberia and then I'll drive up into Nicaragua and have a great, hopefully great week of relaxing, recharging and rest in the jungle.
That sounds absolutely amazing. I'm not jealous at all. During the pandemic, let's go back to the pandemic for a second. The Ontario government offered a staycation tax credit to incentivize local tourism and hospitality within the province with the hopes of, trying to soften the economic blow of the pandemic. Do you think it's time for the Canadian government to consider bringing back some type of similar rebate to encourage people to, vacation in Canada? And also, you mentioned the weak Canadian dollar. It's a further reason to, keep your money north of the border.
Well, I will say that Canadians we're getting a lot more inquiries and demand for Canadians traveling domestically. So they're willing to explore their own backyard. We are seeing increases in destinations like Alberta, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia. So what we've noticed, the East Coast specifically, it would be more affordable. So if you are looking for an affordable vacation, the East Coast would be your best bet. However, what I've been told by our travel experts is that tours, believe it or not, are booking up very quickly, as are car rentals on the East Coast. Now, if you're heading to Alberta, a great place for Canadians to really inject their tourism dollars would be in Jasper.
These days, work is in trouble. We've outsourced most of our manufacturing to other countries, and with that, we sent away good jobs and our capability to make things. American Giant is a clothing company that's pushing back against this tide. They make all kinds of high-quality clothing and activewear, like sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. So when you buy American Giant, you create jobs in towns and cities across the country. And jobs bring pride, purpose. They stitch people together. If all that sounds good to you, visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with promo code STAPLE20.
I mean, all sound like some pretty good options right there. Let's go back to the United States for a second. So hotter U.S. states like Florida, Texas, Arizona, they are known for being typical popular hotspots for Canadian snowbirds. However, new legislation from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services now mandates that anyone traveling to the U.S. for 30 days or more has to register with the government, which includes getting fingerprinted. Failure to do so could result in penalties, fines, and even misdemeanor prosecution. How do you think snowbirds and other long-term Canadian travelers who live and work in the U.S. are taking to this new law?
Well, look, as I mentioned, we definitely have seen a softening in travel to those very destinations that you just mentioned. And it's safety first always. Canadians can still visit the U.S. The U.S. does remain open to Canadians. It just means you need to get all your documents in order, that you've checked the latest requirements. And at the end of the day, the process remains routine for the most part. So Canadians, they're still crossing the border without issue every day. And it's really just working with either a travel expert or just following what's happening on any travel advisories on, Canadian government official websites to understand what papers do you need. And that's the best case scenario, I think, for anyone who is traveling long term for snowbirds to the U.S. is just to really understand what do you need. Have all your documentations in order and, really listen to what the government needs. I think it will be, after a while, travel as usual. We just need to understand what these new policies are. As I mentioned earlier, every time there's a new government, they roll out new U.S. policies. Canadians, we're rather conservative, so we want to understand. And I think within 6 to 8 months, I'm hoping, cautiously optimistic, that things will, normalize in terms of travel between our two nations, and that Canadians will better understand what these new rules are and regulations so that we can just travel freely and again, have this routine process of crossing the border.
Yeah, people historically don't like change, and there's been a lot of it in the last couple of months with how we are used to traveling to the United States. Let's talk about the case of Jasmine Mooney. She was recently on an episode of The Big Story, and she shared her story of what it was like being locked up in Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention, or ICE, if you will, for about 2 weeks as a Canadian who had a valid passport. The story made international headlines, and she was at a San Diego immigration's office reapplying for her work visa when she was taken into custody and then subsequently moved across the country. For Canadians that do travel and work in the United States, how do you think they're reacting to this headline-grabbing case of Jasmine Mooney?
Cases like Jasmine Mooney's, they understandably raise eyebrows, but really this is not the norm. I empathize with what she had to go through. That I couldn't, that must be a very scary experience that she had. However, Canadians are still crossing the border without issue every day. We need to focus on the fact that this is not the norm. This case was the exception. So Canadians, we are still traveling, whether that's for leisure, for business, or to visit family. I would highly recommend that you have all of your documents in order. And that means printing your itinerary. Ensure that you have your flight confirmations. Ensure that you have your accommodation confirmation as well. I know we typically have everything on our phones, but moving forward, I would just go that extra step and print everything before you travel to the U.S. to ensure that there are no complications and that your process remains routine.
I think you're probably right, and common sense would dictate that Jasmine's case is probably the exception and not the rule. But it does, I think, give people cause for pause, maybe make you think twice about crossing the border, even if you have all the correct documentation, as you alluded to. But I want you to break out your crystal ball for us, look into the future. So I know you said that anytime there's change, it takes people some time and things may get back to normal in the next 6 to 8 months. But I'm not talking so much about the administration change. I'm wondering more about this trade war going on. And given that, do you think what we're seeing now in terms of less U.S. travel from Canada, is it the start of a bigger and longer movement? Or do you think these are just sort of recent trends that are reflective of the current patriotic momentum, if you will, and that it won't last?
Me, the shift tells a broader story. So Canadians, they're not canceling their travel. They are being more intentional. In other words, they're really choosing and they're understanding that where they spend their tourism dollars matters. So they're making this sort of really grand stance right now. And they're saying, we will choose where we spend our money because we have that power. At the end of the day, travel, it's not just a privilege, it's a priority for many Canadians and who are willing to adjust. And they will continue to travel and choose where they're going to spend their tourism dollars. So what I'm predicting, or what we're predicting rather here at Flight Centre Travel Group, is that Canadians will be more intentional. They will prioritize and travel with purpose and with curiosity and resilience. They understand, again, that they have strong purchasing power, and where they spend their money and their tourism dollars, inject it in communities that they want, that align with their values, will matter. So I see this as a broad shift and a really good one as well. I think it'll be really positive for the travel industry in the long run.
Amra Durakovic, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Gurdeep.
And that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can leave us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Gurdeep Ahluwalia. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Here in America, work is in trouble. We've offshored our manufacturing, sent away good jobs, and lost so much ability to make things. American Giant is a company that's pushing back against this tide. They make high-quality clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. Visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com, promo code STAPLE20.